Thank you very much, Vicky. So I'm James Law. I'm Professor of Speech and Language Sciences here at the university. And I've known Naomi for a long time. In fact, shortly after Sure Start started, I was asked to tender for some work with Sure Start, looking for a measure, an assessment of very young children's language. And this is really unusual because most times civil servants aren't in the slightest interested in oral language. They're only interested in literacy and in school attainment. So we went along to an interview, and that's when I first met Naomi, and I was really interested at the time that people should be so interested in child development. It may sound a bit strange, but we didn't see it very much in those days, particularly with early years, and oral language was particularly invisible, funnily enough, although everyone learns to do it. So we went for an interview, and we found out about the Sure Start programme, and what was extraordinary, there was this huge investment driven by Norman Glass and Gordon Brown, who was then Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the money was delivered by the Treasury, which is extraordinary because they never give money to social programmes, or haven't done before that. But Naomi was going to be the public face of Sure Start from the start, and she's the one who's chivied everyone into action. It's difficult to think how long this process took. She was there for nearly a decade, and at the centre, so the nexus of policy and practice and research, and that's where it's interesting from my point of view, because she was always open to that. And early years education desperately needed more research. It's always been a bit of a poor relation when it comes to education. So she steered a Sure Start through a forest of ministers and civil servants who came and went, and I think she's been very brave for that. Of course, things have moved on a lot. Universalism is once more under threat. Is childcare there just to get mothers back into the workforce? Should we just be allocating funding to social disadvantage through the pupil premium? Should we be moving towards Michael Marmot's iconic but poorly specified proportionate universalism? These are all questions that are in the air at the moment. We had a report today, in fact, from the Resolution Foundation, which was being picked up in the Tory party conference, which we're expecting the number of children who are disadvantaged, so in poverty, to go up to 3.9 million by 2020. So there's a reversal of policy going on at the moment, and Sure Start was definitely put in place in order to address some of those issues to do with children's well-being. Before I introduce Naomi, I wanted just to read something out to you. We've got her book at the front, a little advert. Policy Press also produced something on the national evaluation of Sure Start. And at the back of that, Professor Sir Michael Rutter, was asked to write an overview. And he picked out 4 things. And the first one was about the government, which he was, pretty critical of, to be honest, of the time. But the second one, so he talks about different headings, and his second one, he says, the second heading concerns the role of Naomi Eisenstadt. She's going to get embarrassed now. Who was given the responsibility for running the Sure Start unit up to 2006. In my view, she comes out as having had a very positive effect on the enterprise as a whole. Of course, as she had to be, she has been loyal to the government throughout, but she has shown 3 crucially important qualities. First, in setting up the scientific advisory group of the National Evaluation of Sure Start, she included people, such as myself, but also others, whom she knew would ask awkward questions and who would be critical when that seemed to be needed. Both at an official and at a personal level, she was firmly committed to getting the best advice that could be attained. Second, while recognising the limitations of the research evidence available, she strove valiantly to use the findings, both positive and negative, to make Sure Start local programmes better. Third, in dealing with all concerned, she injected an intellectual and emotional energy to try and make everything work well. The government was fortunate to have someone of her calibre at the helm. I introduce to you Naomi Eisenstadt. Thank you very much.
Actually, I am slightly embarrassed. The backstory to that is that I had asked Michael Rutter to be on the panel to choose the evaluation team for Sure Start, and he sent me back a 3-page letter on how we were doing everything wrong. And I cried. And then I sort of composed my letter back to him saying, well, what we need is critical friends. So that was precisely why we asked Michael to be, and he agreed to be on, he didn't agree to help select the evaluation panel, but he did agree to be on the peer review that looked at the evaluation. So, and he was, of course, extremely valuable. And some of you in the audience will know that I am still very good at saying what we got wrong, and not that good at reminding ourselves of how much we did well. And right now, it's very important for us to think back and say there were some very, very good things that we did between 1997 and 2010, and things that I'm still proud of. So it's very tough times. One of the things I want to say, because I think some people won't know this, some people in the audience will know this, my first job was in a social services day nursery in Edinburgh, my first job in Britain. I was an early years person in California. I came to Britain as an early years person. I never expected to race to the dizzy heights of running all of early years provision for England. But when I came to Britain and I sent to what was the Department of Education and Science my, basically my resume from university and my CV and what I'd done, because I wanted to teach in a nursery school, and they told me that my qualifications were inadequate, and I had to go back to train as a nursery nurse. They told me that to go back and train as a nursery nurse. And of course, in the English system, I was allowed to be in charge of a £1 billion budget that ran the entire system, but I still wasn't allowed to work in a nursery school. So, yeah, be that as it may, that mix of policy, practice, and research has driven me throughout my life, and the idea that I actually did work at the front line is still very, very important to me. So I'm going to start with what I think the role of government should be in the debates about government. And I'm going to say something about the Sure Start evaluation, something about what we know from the EPI evaluation, and something about, well, what should we be asking for? Even though at this stage it's impossible to get it, we need to have the vision in mind about what we think should be for young children. So there's two things. There's reducing pressures and enhancing capabilities, and obviously safeguarding children. And I think, my big complaint about the current government and the coalition government was that they're very, very keen on enhancing capabilities, but they're not that good at reducing pressures. And in my view, you have to do both at the same time. So they're very good about, evidence-based parenting interventions. They're very good about parental behaviors. They're very good about, if there's problems with the children, it's clearly the parents' fault and they're not doing the right thing. But some of the reasons that the parents aren't doing the right thing are because of the pressures. And my line consistently on it is, if you hold the parenting class in a free laundrette, I'm there. And it's about understanding the pressures that people live in their everyday lives. There's a new book out called Scarcity, and it's a whole book that says it, but I say it in about 3 lines, which is, what are people's priorities? And then where does those things that we want them to do for their kids fit in to the wider priorities of everyday life? And the other example I always give on that is healthy eating, which, middle class, oh, try a little. If you don't like it, we'll have something else. Well, if your kids are hungry and you can only afford a very narrow food, you're going to give them what they eat. You're going to give them what's going to fill them up and isn't the hassle. And it's not, there's, loads of public health studies about, do mothers, and it's always mothers, know about healthy eating? Of course they do. Can they do it, given the other pressures on their life? What's the most important? And I think it's not that we don't want to make sure they do it. I think that if you reduce pressures at the same time as enhancing capabilities, you'll have a much better chance at success. You can't do one without the other. So in terms of policy development, 3 things matter most, and more, family income matters, quality early education matters, and of course, home learning environment matters. So I'm going to go through those. These are things that you've seen for years and years, the links between socioeconomic status and the factors that affect children's outcome, and of course, for this audience, you need to look at vocabulary at 3. It's interesting that James said that it was a pleasure to have someone who was interested in very, very young children. Well, I consider that my main success at the Department for Education is when I arrived, they thought children were born at 5. And by the time I left, they thought children were born at 2. So I didn't do that well, and they never got babies, and I think they still don't get babies. But at least we, and of course, the thing that really upset me when I arrived is that they didn't talk about children, they talked about pupils. And it's a very important thing about talking, because pupils are identified by the institution. in the way that medics talk about patients. They're identified by what my connection to them is. They're not identified as people. So I think these socioeconomic things are really important, but they also indicate how we think about children and families. This is from the Effective Provision of Preschool Education, about early education. One of the things I think that's really important, you can read the slide yourself, but the more and more I think about the EPI studies, and the more and more I think about early education and child care, Joe Blandon did a piece of research quite recently on, did the Blair years investment in child care have the impact on school readiness that we hoped it would? And what she found was that it didn't. And the EPI evidence always said it would. And so I went back to Kathy Silva, my good friend, and Ted Mellish, who led the EPI, and I said, well, how do you explain that? And Kathy actually wrote a very good piece for Nursery World, if you want to pick it up. And her explanation is that EPI, the 8,000 sample of children, half of them were in maintained nursery education. They weren't in child care, and all of them attended 4 or 5 days a week. None of them did 2 long days. None of them did a day here, a day there. So the investment was, what they looked at in EPI was very different from the investment that we put in childcare, which really prized flexibility over quality. So when Joe Blandon looked back, the vast majority of new childcare places that were created under my leadership were in the voluntary sector and the private sector, and they just didn't have the quality. And of course, what this slide shows you is how important quality is to the impact on children. And we're still working on that. I mean, this one's quite interesting. I mean, the one to look at, which I didn't realize is, I mean, clearly the home learning environment is the most important thing, and the mother's education. But until about 6 months ago, it's funny, you look at these slides for 10 years and then you notice something you've never seen. Home learning environment has almost no impact on mathematics. The impact is on literacy. And that's because of language learning in the first 3 years. So it's the link between language learning at home and then literacy that where home learning environment has the massive impact. And an American researcher said, well, the reason that it doesn't have the same impact on numeracy is we don't read bedtime equations to our children. So it is very interesting. It turns out that maths is more teachable than reading, and I think that's counterintuitive because most people feel really uncomfortable about maths, but maths is, in fact, there's very good evidence that it's more teachable, and that really it is the link between language learning in the first 3 years, and people in the audience will know I've been arguing this for a very long time with the Big Lottery and a Better Start program, but language learning in the first 3 years is the foundation on the rest of educational attainment. And I suppose I'll use the 3 examples I like to use in terms of language learning. And one of them is the nursery that I was running in Milton Keynes many years ago. And there was a 3-year-old boy. And it was when we were doing stuff on gender. Do you remember that? Girls' toys, boys' toys. It's terrible how pink everything is now. But anyway, I won't do that rant. I'll do the other rant. Anyway, so we were worried about gender identity. So we had this jigsaw for the children, which was a big butch guy with a mustache doing the washing up. And 3-year-old Clive looked at the puzzle and he started laughing hysterically. And I said, Clive, what's so funny? And he said, that lady has a mustache. So the important point about language is it's the input into children's understanding of the world. And Clive's understanding of the world, it was more likely that she had a mustache than the dad would be doing the washing up. The second one is about language and emotional development. And again, this was a colleague of mine whose son, again, he was 3, and the second grandchild was born. This was his first cousin. And when his granny picked up the baby, he said, put that baby down, I'm your special boy. And what's wonderful about that is that that's not about educational attainment. That's about problem solving and showing your emotions. And what a wonderful adult, I mean, actually he is a wonderful adult, I know him now as an adult, but what a wonderful adult he would be because he could say how he felt. He didn't act out his bad feelings about this baby. He could say how he felt. So language is really important. And the third one was a child who was 3.5 and had been walking along the Thames, and he'd seen one of those riverboats with the big, and about 3 days later, I have to say this is my son, he said to me, something came up with Mississippi, and he said, I saw a Mississippi riverboat, and I said, yes, and he said, that river must have been very shallow for those wheels to go along the ground. Now, again, in terms of cognition, in terms of what he had to understand about circles, and what interested me about it, and this is why I'm so interested in research, is that if he'd got it exactly right, I would have assumed that an adult had explained it to him. It's because he had a theory of the world, and he was making up his theory of the world by what he saw, and the way he expresses that is in language. So in terms of all the things that we want for children, it isn't just educational attainment, it's not just reading score at 9, it's how to be decent human beings. Most important predictor of success is the home learning environment, and now I'm going to go to how we started and how that research, how particularly the EPI research, had a huge impact on what we did and what James referred to. So 1997 to 1999. 1997, I suppose I get cross about forgetting how much progress we made, because, I mean, well, you're old enough, you'll remember. Before 1997, we didn't have a national childcare strategy. We didn't have an ambition to have universal preschool education. We didn't understand. I mean, I have to say, Rita Stringfellow's in the audience. She was doing all this stuff in North Tyneside in the 70s and 80s. She was my hero when I was, working in nurseries. So I think, there were a lot of women who were doing this stuff locally within local government, but there was no national policy. And the 1997 manifesto, the Labor manifesto, had a commitment to universal nursery education and a commitment to a childcare strategy, and that was the first time. But it also, there was this issue about, so there was services for all children, and then after the election, they got very interested in the social class gradient. And I know that some of you may have come to Michael Marmot's talk and heard all about the social class gradient. And they thought we have to do something about services for poor children. And that's how Sure Start was born. So you can read the slide, but part of it was a comprehensive spending review on services for children under 8 that found out that early years services could make a difference, but that there was no overall strategy, and that it could make the biggest difference for the poorest children. And it was a remarkable thing. The first funding was £450 million over 3 years. And I had been running a medium-sized children's charity with a turnover of $6 million a year. So somebody said to me, don't worry, just add loads of zeros. But I certainly did worry. So what happened with Sure Start? Well, some of you will remember when we had the first evaluation findings in 2005, we had what everyone said was the middle class takeover, and it wasn't. And it's one of the big myths that really annoys me about this evaluation. What it found was that among 86% of the sample, we actually had some good results. Greater social competence, fewer child behavior problems, less negative parentings. But the real shocker was among teen mothers, which was a very small percentage, we were doing harm. The children of teen mothers were doing less well in Sure Start areas than in non-Sure Start areas. And we had to figure out what that was all about. I mean, it was it was a terrible, terrible, shocking result. It got a lot of press coverage. But what we found out was a couple of things. One of the things we found out was that teen mothers, in these Sure Start areas, the teen mothers were kind of overwhelmed by the slightly older mothers. So the services that were for the older mothers didn't really work for them. They were put off by them. These women were telling them what to do. The other thing is that really good community services attract the most competent in the locality first. So they attract the people who are, wants the service and needs the service. And the problem you have is the people who need the service but don't want the service. And the people who need the service and don't want the service are usually disliked by the people who want the service and need the service, because they're the ones who aren't really that competent and aren't really that nice. And we accept it. It's a funny thing about schools. We don't say a school is rubbish because all the competent people want to send their children there. We say that's a good school. But Sure Start got really criticized for missing out on the very poorest, but that first sample was dead on the poverty line. So it's always been a myth that it was taken over by the middle class. What happened when we expanded to middle class areas was, surprise, surprise, middle class people liked it and used it. And it was the first service ever that was designed for poor people that everybody wanted. So on the one hand, I'm really proud of that. On the other, of course, it made it very, very difficult to sustain, and it thinned out too much. There were huge differences in quality among the programs. And the key question in the evaluation was, and continues to be, did we tell them to do the wrong thing, or did they not do well enough what we told them to do? And in my view, it was a bit of both. So where you did get good results, there was effective governance and management and leadership. There was a professional ethos in the center, and there was empowerment of service users and providers. So you had all those three features, and the researchers, Ted Mellish and Jay Belsky could tell it. Well, they couldn't tell us because there was a firewall, but they knew that there were particular Sure Start local programs that were getting really good child outcomes. So they went back to look and see what were they doing, and sure enough, what happened next, of the 14 outcomes, we had 7 that showed significant differences, improvements between Sure Start areas and non-Sure Start areas, and there were no differences in subgroups. And of course, what was very upsetting for ministers at the time, and for me personally, was that this got no publicity at all. And these were the really good results. And I suppose, even though that book came out before these results came out, what I felt really proud of and still feel proud of is, what is evaluation for? It's to tell you what's working and what isn't working, and to allow you to fix it. And ministers held their nerve. And we fixed it, and it worked. So it was a remarkable story about how that investment in evaluation, there's never a does it work or does it not work. It's the what is working, what part's working, what aren't working, how do you understand, how do you do the nuance bit. The contract for the evaluation Sure Start was £16 million. So this was all really, really terrifying stuff, but very, very important stuff, and stuff I still feel that, that there was huge political will behind it, and the ministers held their nerves, and we got some very, very good results. And the reason for the differing results, you can see, was the amount of exposure. It took ages to get that was one of the other things, that it takes a long time to spend money, and the Treasury didn't understand that. We didn't understand that. But it does take a long time to spend money. And there was huge differences in quality. And I think one of the things that we got most wrong was we didn't really understand how difficult the task was, and still is, of running at local level interagency, really integrated services for young families. We just didn't understand what a complicated task it was. And part of the story about what a difficult task it is early years is a low-skill workforce. So Norman Glass met Gillian Pugh and Margie Wally and the queens of this area, and thought that we could clone them, and we couldn't. So there was a real problem in building a workforce with the capacity and capability to do this really complex task that we were asking them to do. And I think that was one of the things that we really got wrong. So these are I'm doing this slide now. In terms of what we learned was that you really need interagency collaboration, and it's very hard to make it happen. And it's particularly hard to make it happen in early years services. And I go back to my experience in Milton Keynes when I was running a children's center in the late 70s, the same one with that lady has a mustache. There was a period when this was a center for 3- and 4-year-olds, but a whole bunch of the families, over half of the families who had babies, the babies were in hospital that winter. And at that time, Milton Keynes didn't have a hospital. These were in Aylesbury, which was 20 miles away. And a lot of these mothers didn't have access to a car. We were ferrying them to visit their babies. Now, you can tell I'm American. And I didn't understand the status in Britain. I just didn't understand this at all. And I found out that there was somebody called a community pediatrician. And I didn't know what community pediatricians do. But I thought I should ring her up because, of course, these families came from different estates, so they would have different GPs. I was the only one who would notice that there were so many babies in hospital. Nobody else would notice that. So I rang up the community pediatrician to say, I've noticed this. And she thought I was out of my mind. I worked in a nursery. Why was I ringing a consultant doctor? And the strangest part of the story is 10 years later I was on the Primary Care Trust board as a non-executive director, and of course she didn't recognize me because I wasn't running a nursery. And that's why interagency collaboration is so hard, because of the status differences, because who has the power to make that phone call, who answers the phone call, who's going to return your call, and who gives you some credit for your judgment. So it's not just that the people weren't good enough, it's that they didn't have the authority to say to make the kind of comments on how services worked or didn't work, which is really important. I said about staff capacity problems and the skill requirements, and the capital projects. Dare I say it, I can say it now after all these years, we gave them too much money to build buildings, and they'd spent 3 years building buildings before any services were underway. So how could we expect an evaluation to detect any change in children when they spent all their time trying to get planning permission and finding a place to build the building? And it's not that, it's a very difficult thing to commission a big building. And it was great having beautiful buildings in very poor areas, but it took huge amounts of time, and we way underestimated it. So where are we now? Well, I'm anxious about where we are now because I think there are 3 goals, and they are in tension in early years services. And there's workforce participation, there's early education, and then there's integrated family support. And sadly, all the efforts we made to bring this under, as one story have in more recent years fractured again. So that means we weren't we were unsuccessful in bringing it all together. And a lot of things that are currently happening on the story about flexibility, on working families, on 8 to 6. Do we really want our 2-year-olds in childcare from 8 to 6? Is this really a nice thing for a small child? And you know what? Despite what Michael Rudder said, I don't care what the research says. I actually care about the experience of the child while the child is a child. I mean, obviously I care what the research says, but I also care about the experience for the child now. And I've gotten increasingly resistant about very long hours in full daycare. I don't think it's good. I think it's institutionalizing children too young. So I think there's a real problem about that. I mean, early education is great for kids, but it's hopeless if mothers want to work and fathers want to work. And the integrated family support is more and more becoming very, very targeted. And it's targeted on individual families. I mean, on Sure Start, we did area targeting. We didn't do individual family targeting. And the problem with individual family targeting is, I mean, there's a problem with stigma, but I would think stigma is overrated. If it's a really good service, people lie to get in it rather than avoid the stigma. The problem is that you always miss the families on the cusp. No matter where you put your entry barrier on a targeted service, you always miss those families who just fall below the line. And those that just fall below the line with a much less expensive service, you could just push them over. But of course, what worries me now with all the benefit cuts and increasing child poverty is that we're going to push children over the other way. So the current provision is 15 hours, free childcare for all children, you know that. I think the expansion of 30 hours is crazy. I was against the labor expansion to 25 hours. I was even against the 2-year-old offer because currently our offer for 3 and 4-year-olds is not good enough. And there's a real problem about constantly adding more and more and more without working on the quality. And the only way to make our offer for 3 and 4-year-olds is to have better qualified staff. Now, you need to think about what happened when Liz Truss, I'm sure you never expected me to extol the virtues of a Tory minister, but Liz Truss said that to enter childcare as a profession, you should have C-grade GCSE English and maths. And the providers were horrified. C-grade English and maths. This is not a high barrier for the people who will be looking after our children and talking to children who are 2 years old. And when Margaret Hodge and I used to go around centers and we look at the written reports on the kids, they couldn't spell, they couldn't write. This is not the fault of the people entering childcare training. It's that we need a better qualified, better paid career progression workforce. And it's the only way to build the quality that EPI tells us works for kids. And the difficulty is it's a big ticket item. It's expensive. If we want childcare just for working parents, which is really important, then you can get it on the cheap. If you want childcare that is really going to have an impact on children's long-term outcomes, you need better quality, and you get better quality with better staff. And it's not to criticize the current workforce who are working incredibly hard. It's to criticize a system that, even when I was working in nurseries, saw childcare as the hair or care option for the girls who weren't going to university. And I say the girls. The girls. So, you know, the only way we're going to do it is by getting a better workforce. And our current provision isn't good enough. And the more we add more hours, we will not add enough money to improve the quality of the provision, and the provision will get thinner and thinner. And the pupil premium, I mean, look at the difference in numbers. It's shocking. So they're doing the same thing on the pupil premium that they do on staff in childcare. Yeah, it's absolutely shocking. So who provides? The voluntary sector and the private sector, state maintained, and you have the same tension between high quality inflexible and lower quality flexible. And it's not, it's not that the voluntary and private sector don't want to provide high quality, it's that the funding mechanisms don't allow it. The funding mechanisms are simply not enough. And if they're not enough now on 15 hours, what are they going to be like when we try to expand to 30 hours? Because there's no question that they're not going to be able to do it. So what happened to Sure Start? Well, we got children's centers established in the last government, 3,500, and I have to say I was always against the 3,500, and I'm on record as saying that. I think that you want your really high quality integrated centers in your poorest areas. And I think as soon as you try to make it for everybody, it's like a spoonful of rice for everyone doesn't do anything for the hungry, and it doesn't do anything for the not hungry. You need to do the proportionate universalism, and the best way to do proportionate universalism is to have your integrated services in your poor areas with open access. And I say open access, not universal. Universal is an entitlement. Open access means those who want to use them can. It's a fundamental difference in early years services that I think the DFE never understood, and that's that it's optional. It's not like school. You don't go to jail if you don't send your kids. And that's why you need a service that parents like, as well as a service that's good for their kids. And bringing those two together is really, really tough. Well, what the coalition government did was they removed the dedicated funding part. So it's not just that many have closed, it's the ones that haven't closed are hollowed out. So the local authority can say, well, we haven't closed our children's centers. And then when you look at what the children's centers are offering, it's a person and a bunch of leaflets that's open 2 days a week. And then they say, but we offer all the services, but they're 10 miles here, 3 miles there. They're not offered in a way that's integrated that the poorest families can make the best use of them. So it's a sort of, I mean, it's not a happy sight. So where are we now? A Better Start, which is lottery funded. I'm very excited about it. I've been involved in it since the beginning. I think the lottery is doing an amazing job about saying we want strategic investment in early years. And basically, my role on A Better Start has been to spend a lot of time telling them what we got wrong on Sure Start. So spending a lot of time on workforce development, spending a lot of time on how you plan the development, having fewer outcome measures, but clear about what the input should be. And it's because it's lottery and not government, it's funded over 10 years. So I would say that it's informed by Sure Start, but hopefully we're going to get some really good results, but who knows. I mean, interestingly enough, we're having the same problems in terms of how long it takes to get going, how difficult it is to recruit staff, how hard it is to find leaders who can run these sorts of centers. And the other thing that we're doing in A Better Start, which I think was one of the Sure Start mistakes, is that for those areas that got the funding, they had to demonstrate that the local authority and the health system was putting some of their own money in. Not matched, but at least buying into the integration at the very beginning. Whereas in Sure Start, we had enough money so that we could buy our own health visitors, we could buy our own speech therapists. We didn't have to have that buy-in from the system, so the system didn't change. With a Better Start, what we're really looking at is that buy-in from the standard local authority and health services, so that the system itself changes, not just a new bunch of services. And, well, we'll see. I'll be very old by the time it's finished. I feel pretty old now. So I'm almost done. How has the policy landscape changed? Well, I do think there's too much attention to affordability and not enough to quality. I think it's really interesting. I mean, I did this slide before Cameron's speech yesterday. And all of a sudden he's interested in, that's not fair. He's interested in poverty and inequality. But they think that poverty and inequality is about educational attainment. They think that social mobility is about educational attainment. I'm going to say more on the next slide on that. I mean, right now the 2-year-old offer, in my view, is not of sufficient quality to make the difference. And one of the craziest things that on the 2-year-old offer is that, okay, so it's the bottom 2 quintiles, 40%. And it's meant to be because EPI found that if you started between 2 and 3, it was better than starting at 3, which is all good news. But EPI was half day, 5 days a week, teacher-led. So some local authorities that don't have enough 2-year-old places are putting the 2-year-olds with childminders. Now, I'm a great believer in childminders, but why is that better? It's not group care, it's not teacher-led, it's nothing to do with what the pilot on the 2-year-old offer said worked. So you have this sort of pronouncement from government that says, great, we're going to listen to the research, and then what happens is completely different from what the research says. So I'll try to be more cheerful. I'll try to be more cheerful. I think that there's an issue about what we should be asking for. I don't think that there's a chance of getting it now, but I think we have to keep our eye on the prize, and we should, comfort ourselves with how far we've come, because the fact that all the parties have policies on early years, the fact that they all talk about childcare is a dramatic change. The fact that they talk about early intervention, all these things were not in place 20 years ago. So I think all that is a really good idea and is really good. But as I say, I do think children's centers fully funded in the poorest areas is the best way to do it. And in the non-poor areas, we have to make better use of our primary schools. We have to make better use of the infrastructure that exists. We have to, one of the language I use, which is very American, is we have to sweat the asset. And one of the things I usually say to British audiences, if you want to feel good about children's services in the UK, all you have to do is look west, because it's terrible in America. If you want to feel bad, you look east. If you want to feel good, look to the States. All the sort of programs, the evidence-based programs come from the States, but the numbers of children, very, very few states have universal preschool education. Of course, nobody, Obamacare is beginning to settle in, but it's still really contentious, and think of what he went through to get it through and how long it took for the Americans to have any system on health care. So if you want to feel good, that's why I stay here, just look west. If you want to feel bad, look east. I still think we haven't done enough about under 2s. I think particularly, oddly enough, in terms of language development, we haven't done enough about under 2s. I don't think, aside from a few interventions, we don't know what works. But the key problem is about parents themselves, and it's not just vocabulary, it's the complexity of grammar. It's how we interact with children when they're very, very little. And it's a very, very hard thing to solve. We won't solve the social class gradient through education. We will make contributions to it, but there's other things that we need to do. I'm almost at my 45 minutes, so this is what I think the real problem is. Government's always trying to do more with less, well, we know that. But it's the second one that's interesting. I think there is something peculiar about the Anglophone countries, the US, the UK, Australia, Canada. They just don't trust their government to spend their money. And I was speaking to a Danish colleague of mine, and he was saying that in Denmark, they don't trust the politicians very much, but because there is so much less inequality, the amount of taxes that people pay is much more equal, because incomes are less unequal. So there isn't the resentment on paying the taxes because everybody feels they're paying a fair share and everybody is getting the services back. And that's the other problem about highly targeted services, is that services for everybody miss the poorest, but services for the poorest are often poor services. And the better off are resentful of the services that they get because they feel like their taxpayers' money are paying for them. So there's a real problem in it. We have seen increasing inequality, and I've spoken to lots of labor colleagues about this. Certainly I spoke to some Lib Dems. One of the key issues on inequality is not income, it's capital. Most people in this room probably live in a house that they either own or have a mortgage on. And you expect that when you die, your children are going to get that. Well, the families who rent don't have something to leave to their children. And it's the capital inequality that's massive in this country. And I think we need a massive great inheritance tax. And I think, the odd thing, I heard there was somebody on TV yesterday about £1 million, somebody who lived in a house in Newham or something, and now it's tiny, and he just sold it for £1 million. And he said, I've lived in this house for 22 years, and the value increase in it is higher than my wages has ever been. So he didn't work for that value increase. It's not hard working. It's not because he was clever. It's not because he was great. It's because he happened to be lucky enough to buy in the right place at the right time. And people of my age are largely in that position. And people in the next generation aren't. And inequality is driven by that because my son grows up knowing at some point, probably a long time because my genetics are pretty good on old age, but knowing that you're going to inherit changes everything. It changes your life path. It changes the risks you take. So in terms of social mobility, education isn't going to do it. It is about inequality in incomes and inequality in capital that creates social mobility. So right now, the differences are greater than they were 20 years ago in terms of your chances when you're born. So that's my last, but I don't want to leave you miserable. So I'll tell you a couple of funny stories, and then I'm going to stop. So the funny stories that are in the book, this may encourage you to get the book, is that when I was writing the book, I interviewed all the ministers I worked for, and it was a great treat because I really did like them, and they were lovely people. You may not believe that, but I feel very, very loyal towards the ministers I worked for, and they were terrific about talking to me. And a lot of stuff came out about Brown and Blair that I didn't know because it's all come out now. But when Yvette Cooper took over from Tessa Jowell, this was like within 6 months, and I interviewed David Blunker, who didn't want Yvette. He said to me, well, she was Gordon's girl, wasn't she? That was a bit weird. This was like 15 years later, he's still saying she was Gordon's girl. But the funniest thing that happened is when we launched, 2004, we launched the 10-year childcare strategy, which I consider, a major achievement of my working life. Most of it's still in place. Some of it isn't, but it was an amazing piece of work. And so it was going to be launched at the pre-budget report that Gordon Brown was giving in Parliament, but we had the stakeholders in number 11 Downing Street to hear him on closed-circuit TV give the speech. And again, you have to realize, 2004, when were we ever waiting on tenterhooks for a pre-budget report that was going to say a lot about children? This in itself was an amazing achievement. So at 11 o'clock in the morning, somebody from number 11 Downing Street rang my staff to say that they couldn't get the TV to work. Now, I'm good, but I'm not that good. And it was, seriously, this is the center of government. They can't get the TV to work. So we couldn't do anything, and they finally figured out that it was the wrong aerial. And the right aerial was in number 10. And none of the workmen would carry it down the corridor. Carrie Oppenheim had to put it under her coat and carry it into number 11 for the launch of the 10-year childcare strategy, because nobody in number 10 would help anybody in number 11. We launched it. It was terrific, and it's still a very good document. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Naomi. I'm delighted that your genetics are so good. So let's have some questions. Lots of interesting stuff in there. I'm sure lots of people have got some thoughts, anything they'd like to ask.
Or comments.
Yeah, comments too.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I just didn't get my head around the bit about inequality in capital. That really kind of surprised me. I can see how in the long term it would benefit. But I think this audience is probably full of people about my own age, from working class families who went through grammar school and had all sorts of kind of steps up on the ladder, but capital was something we just didn't anticipate, and in fact we never got it. So what's the hard evidence that an expectation of capital by the time you're 60 or 70 or 80, when your parents finally die, is really going to do you all that much good? Thank you.
I mean, actually, Danny Dorling writes a lot about it. It's about whether you're going to inherit or not. And those who aren't going to inherit have a lifelong disadvantage in terms of the kinds of risks they take. But the good writing on it is Danny Dorling's on capital. And also Piketty is, of course, written on capital.
Okay. And next.
I think I'm rather simplistic about everything in this, but for many decades I've maintained that primary school teachers should be the best paid teachers because they are the ones who have to lead children into learning to enjoy education, which seems to have been forgotten altogether, and so that children will be encouraged to want to read, write and learn. The other is that it was very sad because of part of my profession. As a health visitor, I have been very distressed at how the health visitors have been taken outside the homes, and it's all done within the clinic now, and particularly when you were speaking about the first 2 years of the baby, when as health visitors we used to have very regular contact with the mothers within the home, and very often that is where a mother wants to talk about her child. She doesn't want to go to an impersonal clinic. It's very nice, and you can have a nice little social event there sometimes with other mothers, but the important things are usually discussed at home with a regular visit. Thank you. I have thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you. I agree with that. Just on the primary teachers, one of the things that most people don't know about High Scope, the peri-preschool project that got the whole thing going, is that the teachers, that it was all trained teachers, and they were paid a premium because it was such a dangerous neighborhood. So those teachers in High Scope were paid more than ordinary teachers, not less.
Okay. I've got one question, which is about the devolved countries, right? So we now have a natural, we had some colleagues here from Scotland, I know that. So we have a natural experiment going on between the different countries in the UK. Sure Start that you were dealing with was English. What seems to be happening is the Early Years Collaborative in Scotland seems to have picked up a lot of this story and seems to be continuing with it, especially around the training. And I wonder whether you could comment on the differences between Wales and England, Northern Ireland, Scotland. I know you have some experience of Scotland.
Yeah, I can't comment on Wales or Northern Ireland. I can comment on Scotland. I looked at the Early Years Collaborative a couple of years ago, and it's a very interesting approach because it's about an integrated approach where you're measuring very little changes and keeping very close contact with it. I think it's a very good thing because it allows you to change as you go along, and it's not about, big randomized control trial. It's much more about reflective practice as you go along. What worried me about it is that it also needs a sort of step back on overall goals because some of the very little changes you were measuring were very processy, they weren't outcomey. So I think it's a both and. And I have to say, I've been doing a lot of work in Scotland, and the First Minister knows that I'm really depressed that they're promising 30 hours free. Because I think it's the wrong move. I think it's the same argument about, get the quality right first and then get more. But we've been discussing that. But I can't comment on Wales. I would say that, certainly in Scotland, there's a much stronger commitment on poverty issues and a much broader consensus on how you address these issues. And it looks to me, because it's all smaller, there's much better cross-government working. There's a stronger political will at government, and all bits of government are involved in it. but who knows? It is a natural experiment,
Yeah.
so we'll see.
And they'll draw further and further
Yes.
apart, one assumes, over time.
Yeah.
Other thoughts, other questions at the front here? Yeah. Microphone? Yeah.
Thanks so much, Naomi. That was fascinating. I wonder if it's a little bit to one side, but I wonder if you could make any comment about the fact that children begin school when they're 4 in this country. There was a magic moment when I thought a minister might actually go to raise the school starting age. I've got grandchildren in the States who, begin at 6, and of course in mainland Europe it's an entirely different story. And the outcomes at the end of secondary education seem to be much better in those countries.
Yeah, I think that we schoolify too early, and I think, as the speaker at the top said, I think that the primary education, what's a shame is that we don't bring the earliest principles up. We bring the very structured school stuff down, and I think that that's been damaging. But, one of the things I think politically is that parents would be really against raising the school age, because then it would fall into the free childcare thing, and then you would have all those problems about the money and about working and all that. The big spike in returning to work comes at school age. So all the things that we've done on hugely increasing the amount of childcare available, it has not had the impact on employment that we thought it would. The big spike comes at school age. So if you change school age, you would affect that in the economy, and it would be deeply unpopular. I don't think the sort of starting age matters as much as what is it we mean and what happens in the school, and that's what bothers me, is the formality. And just, having it fun.
Okay.
I found it very informative. Just looking at your screen there, social mobility and concept of equality. Do you not find, or do you think that possibly policies for social mobility are incompatible with equality, in that social mobility actually exists because there is inequality?
Well, the way that Danny Dorling will describe it, and I use him a lot, is that in countries that have less inequality in terms of the band, the steps between social classes are less steep. So you get more social mobility because the implication of going one way or another is less critical. And that's, one of the things I always say is, the problem is me, because social mobility, relative social mobility means that someone has to go down as somebody going up, and it's not going to be my kid. So we're all very, very good at protecting the place for our children. If I can take a minute, it's stories from my background. When I worked in the nursery in Milton Keynes, and there was 4-year-old Darren, and we did the stuff on gender. And Darren's mum said to me, this is really important, because maybe when he grows up, this was in the early 80s, time of the miners' strike, when lots and lots of white working class unemployment, the big, shifts in employment status. She said, maybe when he grows up, he won't be working, and his wife will, and I don't want him to feel bad. What she was seeing around her was massive unemployment for the family she knew and the class she knew. But her response to that wasn't so he should work hard in school. The response to that was he should find a rich wife. But he's 4 years old. He's 4 years old, and she's already planning for him to not be in a job. And I found that really, really deeply depressing. And I contrast it with when I was in the exalted halls of the Department for Education, and my colleague was taking her daughter to Cambridge University for her interview, and would explain in the car about the questions, because that person went to Cambridge. Now, the difficulty is both these people are really good parents. And leveling the playing field on that, I think, is extraordinarily difficult and is much wider than education. And that's why I think the social mobility and equality story are tied together, because the more unequal the society, the steeper the steps, and the more people like us protect it for our children.
Okay. Kim, just at the back.
Thank you very much. I'm head of the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists in Scotland, so I'm interested in your comments about your activity there, but the reason I say that is because it explains why, along with others, I'm campaigning to get into the manifesto for Scottish Parliament the next time round, 2016. I joined up comprehensive action, if you like, a speech and language communication strategy for Scotland that spans preconception to 25 years or into adulthood, and to try to tackle the intergenerational issues around speech, language and communication, parents' own capacities, impact on their child's own capacities, impact on their ability to access all those protective services or those sort of capability enhancing services, and to reduce the pressures. And I just wondered what your view is on the pursuit of the childcare strategy, but what about a strategy that was specifically focused on speech, language and communication strategy that really did link up things like the First Minister's attainment goals with youth justice, with youth employment, with parenting, all those sorts of things, because it feels like we keep almost reaching the point on speech, language and communication in little patchy little places, but we're not kind of using our assets across the piece in order to break that intergenerational cycle.
I think it's a great idea, and I'd like to talk to you some more. I think the real question is, how do you make it join up into the system, and what are the contributions at, in each place? And the difficulty is that people always think of it as the specialism of speech and language rather than the generic language skills that we all need. So if there was a way to communicate it in that way, certainly, I'm currently advising them, so, I'm the independent advisor on poverty to the Scottish Government, so so I'm looking for ideas.
Okay, so there was a couple in the front. This one's fine.
Hi, Naomi. You were right in terms of the leadership of children's centres, and those of us that have been in it since '97. Yes, it did take us a long time, and we took an inordinate amount of time talking to architects, getting used to bricks and mortar and sewerage systems. We took a long time to get going. We also came from massive varied backgrounds, from community development, teaching, health visiting. And then we had a bit of a great time when we were recognised, and the leadership was recognised through the National College of School Leadership and NPQICL. The National College of School Leadership has quite royally dumped us. We have nowhere to go. I just wondered, in terms of, did you have any views on where, or do you know of places where we can gather together to keep our leadership going? And also, who should we be talking to? Because we've just been cast adrift and we're all trying to hang on to each other for dear life.
Yeah, I mean, there was that bright spark when we had the NPICL, and I think it is a real tragedy that we've gone back to just school leadership, not integrated service leadership. The difficulty is that if there isn't a national commitment to integrated services at early years, then there isn't going to be a national commitment to the people who lead them. So I don't have a happy answer for you. I think it's a real struggle, but it's worth thinking about.
This question over there.
I'm a fellow of the Royal College of Midwives, and what worries me is that I think that the mother and the child as a unit has really been lost out of these discussions about early development. We did some very interesting work in the 80s in Newcastle, which was integrated social service, housing, debt collecting, and it was evaluated for the 4 years that it worked. But what was interesting, and I think you raised the issue, was that the hierarchy and the impossibility of actually politically getting work that has been evaluated accepted and integrated into the service.
Well, that's part of my story, that I think we've still missed the under-twos. I think we've and I think that the issue about health visiting and midwifery and under-twos is still a real gap. And just part of the, again, things that we got wrong. I think one of the we moved all of children's services, children's social care, from the Department of Health to the Department for Education. And I was in favor of that at the time, and the reason now I think that was a mistake, or that I say we didn't manage the risks, is the risk that brought about was that it significantly weakened the voice of children in the Department of Health. So all the Department of Health had left was midwifery and acute. It didn't have an integrated story about children, babies right through to 15, 16, 18. And I think that resulted in the kinds of things that you're describing in terms of losing the mother and the baby. And the real champion on that stuff was always Tessa Jowell, and she still is. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you, but I think that the structural changes we made contributed to that breakdown, and I think that it was a failure.
Question, Colin?
That's really interesting, Naomi. I think you know that, probably 6 to 8 weeks ago, the Minister announced a review of the accountability framework, and more recently Ofsted have suspended their entire inspection programme for children's centres. I just wonder whether you think that's a threat or an opportunity?
Good question.
Well, the difficulty is that government, even in my time, could never decide what children's centres should do. So you can't have an accountability framework if you don't have a clear notion about what... I mean, the big problem is they took the model from school. And here's the story about schools. I mean, in the old days, I know it's not true with academies and free schools now, but in the old days, first of all, it's still true. Every child has to go to school. So there's no choice on that. So you don't have to make it happy for the parent. You have to, every child has to go to school. There's a uniform workforce of teachers. So every school has to have teachers. I know it's not true anymore, but it was true. When Michael Barber was designing the accountability framework, every school had teachers. And all the teachers had a pretty much common training framework. And every adult in the land knew what schools were for and believed that most children, it was a good idea that they could read and do sums. So you could do a national literacy and numeracy strategy because you could pull a lever and train every teacher in the land and say every school in the land must. There's no other piece of social intervention or indeed health intervention where that's the same thing. And that's why people never got the idea that the children's center problem is that you don't have to go, so you have to do things that pull people in, that make parents happy. But the things that make parents happy aren't necessarily going to have good outcomes for the children. And that tying together, I mean, I got into the biggest trouble because when, London is, of course, incredibly pepper pot. Rich people live next to poor people. Andrew Donis lives in Hackney. And when he was the education person in number 10, he got a leaflet to his door inviting him to aromatherapy session at his local children's center. And the building shook. God, did we get in trouble? What's the evidence base for aromatherapy? Well, maybe it's what the parents asked for, and maybe getting them in is a good idea. And maybe once you get them in, you do something about language or reading or whatever. But that's the fundamental, there is so much misunderstanding about how early year services work. So how you design an accountability framework without a clarity about what is this meant to achieve, and you have so many things it's meant to achieve. We had a public service agreement framework with 16 outcomes, and half of them couldn't be measured. But actually measuring literacy and numeracy is not that hard. So I think if it helps them make clear about what it's meant to do and then how much it costs to do it, it could be an opportunity. But if it's just more waffle, I don't think it's going to help at all, because once they figure out what it costs to do, they're going to shrink back from the accountability.
Yeah, it's one here.
Hi, Naomi, I enjoyed your talk very much, but I wanted to ask you about evidence and policy, because during the evening you've talked a lot about evidence, you've talked about eye-watering amounts of money being spent on evaluations. You just mentioned a minister asking what was the evidence basis for aromatherapy, and yet you're telling a story of evidence being ignored in the formulation of policy and the direction policy has gone. Do you have any reflections on the use of evidence in policy and the idea of evidence-based policy?
The language they like to use is evidence-informed policy. I'm a pragmatist. So I think, I'm really interested in the evidence. I'm interested in design. I'm interested in replication. But I think that you have to be pragmatic. What I don't want to do is claim, I mean, the childcare story, which I find really frustrating, is that they say the evidence is this way of delivery works, and then they deliver something that's completely different, and then they're surprised they don't get the results. So if your aim is to increase employability, that's fine. Just be clear about what you're measuring. And that's where I have problems, is that politicians always want to kill at least 3 birds with 1 stone. And usually you can only kill 1 bird with 1 stone. And that's why part of that is the integrated, the evidence on integrated services is actually very weak in terms of child outcomes, but it's very strong in terms of parental access. So parents, for good reason, like integrated services, because you go to one place and you can get lots of information, lots of different things, but actually to identify that then that results in a better reading score at 6, none of that evidence exists. But actually delivering a service that parents want is a first step to actually getting something in there that will work. And again, that was one of our failures. We worked so hard on the engagement that we forgot what the engagement was for. But we got the engagement, most popular program ever. And I'm proud of that.
Okay, any other questions? Oh, sorry, Tom.
You said that to see, if we looked east, we would feel bad about what was happening here. But you also said that we spent the money on evaluation, and the Americans actually do the research quite well, even if they don't deliver it to everyone. So how have the other countries actually achieved the good programs if actually we've been spending the monies on finding out what works?
Because their language, they think the language of programs is batty. I mean, I've never been, but the very famous one in northern Italy, Emilia Romagna, which is everyone says is the best in the world. You ask them about, have you ever been evaluated? They look at you like you're crazy. They look at the children. They say, look how happy these children are. What a weird idea. And they just don't evaluate. They don't look at it in that scientific way. And in the same way, I feel the same way about, I'm waiting for the randomized control trial on school. I'm waiting for them to take, a random group of 8-year-olds out of school for a year to see what happens. We have to agree that there's a basic level of service, and then figure out how you deliver that service to whom and which ways works the best. So I think schools do huge amounts of work on what's the best reading program. And they will use lots of evidence on that, and they will do that really sensibly. But they don't fundamentally say, well, that reading program didn't work, we're going to close schools. We're not going to have schools anymore. I'm tired of trying to make the case. I just think we've won the case on early years. I actually think there's, I think that we've lost. I think that there are other bits of childhood that we actually haven't paid enough attention to. We've won the case on early years, but what we have to do is keep getting what we've already got in place better based on evidence, and not say, do we need it or do we not need it?
Okay, I've got one more question actually, which is about fathers and about grandparents. Right? We always talk about mothers and babies, and that's where everyone's referred to this, and obviously it's very relevant. But Sure Start, in some areas of Sure Start, they were very interested in this wider social unit rather than this nuclear family. And I wonder whether you've got any views about that on reflection, whether you think that Sure Start did a good job with the wider family, or was it really just about institutions?
Some did, some didn't. There were some really good programs that worked very hard to engage fathers, and some programs had special, events for grandparents and wider family and extended family. And particularly if you were working, say, in Bradford, then you would certainly include the extended family, because that was really important in those communities. So it depended on the community. I do have a feeling about grandparents in terms of childcare, because for the poorest parents, for the poorest families, the grandparents are in their 40s and should be in work. And you're just extending poverty to the next generation. And the idea that grandparents give up their jobs to look after their grandchildren just makes them poor. So they're not investing in their pension. In terms of women and women's equality, I think it's a real issue, because it will be the grandmother.
There's some interesting things that came out of growing up in Scotland, actually, which is a sort of about the logic model around using parents, because they said that the health visitors didn't have much of these parenting classes that health visitors delivering didn't work for teenage parents, because they didn't want it. They wanted to listen to their parents So they were using their parents as the model, as it were. And I wonder whether Sure Start ever got involved with grandparents to give them the messages about child development, I should say.
Not that I know of. But I have to say, having grown up in New York in kind of Woody Allen land, the idea that you do anything like your parents did would be completely weird. And I remember, I read Freud when I was 15, and I said, don't blame your parents, blame your grandparents. And my father was from Vienna, so I knew what I was talking about.
Okay, I think that's probably enough. Is there any last minute questions? I think we should say thank you. Oh, do you want to say one?
Well, just a quick one as a follow-up to what James said. In one of your earlier results, the slides showed that how mothers' education was really one of the most important factors. And speaking about evidence and policy, educating the moms, would that be something that would be a priority?
Well, it's mother's education at birth. At the birth of the child, sorry. So you can't then, after the child's born, educating the mother, there isn't evidence that that's...
We do have some data on that, actually.
The evidence shows that if the mother gains an education...
It will... terrific.
But it's not causal, it's promote home.
Right, okay. But that, I mean, I always felt that in terms of role modeling, because I did lots of OU courses when my son was at school, and we were sort of studying together and doing, but that wasn't evidence, that's just anecdote. But yeah, I mean, that is an interesting issue. I feel that some of our, when we had disappointing results, sometimes I wonder in terms of second child. Because that's the other thing I think that we always, lose on, is that we always think about the dyad, and not about if you're improving parenting, then are there better experiences for the next child because it's from birth, not by the time the child is 3 or 4. So I'm slightly optimistic on that, but I have no evidence on that at all. I just think it makes sense. So.
Okay, so I'm going to say thank you very much, and a last round of applause for Naomi. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.